Alright, Jim, I'll admit that Tesla is kind of cool.
Yes, but they're not even at their full potential yet. You realize the best-selling vehicles in the United States are pickup trucks, right?
Yeah, I know.
And the Cybertruck is the most aerodynamic and efficient electric pickup truck to hit the market, so they're going to be able to build them so much faster and so much more profitable than anyone.
Yeah, I know. I drive a pickup. I use it for stuff, too. I get it.
Man, I just can't wait to go off-roading and go camping in my pickup truck, loaded up with wood and tow cross-country with the superchargers.
You know what? As they get the range up higher a bit and the price comes down, I'm very excited to check out the Cybertrucks, too.
But you don't need to buy a Cybertruck. Actually, you don't need to buy anything.
What? Why?
Because the RoboTaxis are coming. The RoboTaxis are going to be so efficient, so small, and so cheap to ride in that it won't even make sense to buy and own vehicles anymore.
Wait, so...
It's going to fall down to like 20 cents, 15 cents a mile to just ride a RoboTaxi. There will be no need for Cybertrucks.
Am I supposed to, go off-roading and go camping and, like, haul stuff with the little RoboTaxi?
Yeah. That's all you need a car for, right?
Does regular free autopilot even work when you have a trailer?
No, but the software team will get to that later.
You mean like they got to park assist later?
To the moon! Alright, so I've explained in previous videos why I have my doubts. Forgive me for being skeptical after all of these missed timelines. After hearing Elon say they expect to have over 1 million robo-taxis by 2020, and we're almost into the second quarter of 2023 as to when robo-taxis will actually be here. Yes, I see a lot of progress and a lot of development with full self-driving beta. I watch all the videos, I keep up to date with it, but I've seen almost zero progress when it comes to assuming more liability. Tesla has still not ever once let you say, actually, you know what, you don't have to keep your hands on the wheel anymore, or you don't have to look at the road. So basically, I think we've come a long way in the past 5 to 7 years when it comes to full self-driving technology, but I still see the overall hurdle, the overall climb we have to make as still a lot greater than what we've already achieved. And the last trail of nines, that last couple percent of driving that Teslas can't autonomously do right now, I think is actually going to take the bulk of the work. But I could talk all day just on why I don't think robo-taxis are going to be super feasible, nor do I think they will take away the demand for car ownership. But I'm going to go ahead for the sake of this video say, what if I'm wrong? Maybe the neural nets are getting just that crazy good, and with the current limitations of the blind spots on hardware 3 and the clumsiness of a lot of full self-driving beta decisions today, let's just assume they're gonna solve all those problems and figure out all those edge cases and reach the point where robo-taxis and just Teslas in general are able to drive 10 times safer than the average human. 10 times 0 is still 0, but no, still, for the sake of this video, I'm just going to admit defeat and say, yes, it eventually will happen. Well, the reason so many companies are passionate about trying to figure out robo-taxis is there's essentially a huge pot of gold at the end of the rainbow for anyone that is able to crack this mysterious code. Because right now, ride-sharing companies like Uber or Lyft or even taxi companies struggle to really turn that much of a profit, but once you have a cheap-to-build electric car, like Tesla's third-generation vehicle platform, and now you no longer need to pay a driver, this vehicle can be operated practically all day and night. Granted, you have a supercharger in the area to top it off, and I guess someone to maintain it, make sure the tires get rotated, or make sure the interior gets cleaned up from messes that customers may leave behind. And once you remove that human from the equation, now the cost of transportation drops substantially. That's Tesla's mindset. It helps support their mission statement to say that a robo-taxi fleet of electric vehicles can replace 5 times as many gas cars as just selling non-autonomous electric vehicles. But where I still take issue with this grand vision is that, at least right now, superchargers don't have, the theoretical snake chargers to plug themselves in. And once we eliminate the human driver from the equation, now the battle of robo-taxis comes down to who can achieve the lowest cost per mile, who can achieve the least amount amount of maintenance required and who can be the most energy efficient, because basically whichever vehicle has the most amount of range and it requires the least amount of energy to obtain that range, that's the vehicle that's going to perform best as a RoboTaxi. Once we start getting into the like 20 cents per mile, 18 cents per mile, and start dropping below 10 cents per mile, every little watt hour starts to count, which is why, in my personal opinion, even in the world of RoboTaxis that so many Tesla bulls believe in, where everybody stops buying cars because they can just ride around in RoboTaxis for cheaper, I think the Aptera design language, whether it comes from Aptera as a startup company or not, is the inevitable solution for most of these RoboTaxis, and I'll tell you exactly why I think this design is essentially inevitable. Because a lot of people are riding vehicles around cities and usually even briefly getting on highways, and air resistance at high speed typically ends up being the greatest enemy of an efficient vehicle, pushing all of that air out of the way, and no other vehicle prioritizes aerodynamics the way the Aptera does. It even has less rolling resistance because of its 3 tires, and there's no axles to worry about. In-hub motors allow for a lot less losses from the already incredibly efficient electric powertrain, and when you have a design that insanely efficient, that's when solar on electric vehicles actually starts to make sense. You can slap some solar panels on that thing, and like we talked about with the hyper-efficient Aptera, with hypothetically, like Chris Anthony said, maybe an 18 kilowatt hour battery pack, that's when the solar might actually start to translate to over 40 miles of range per day. And whether you want to go the hyper-efficient route, or maybe you just want to go the hyper-long range route, like doing a 600 mile range Aptera, or maybe even 1,000, whichever hyper-efficient vehicle on the road that can go the longest without stopping, and more importantly, not require a person to maintain it, that's the vehicle that's going to undercut everybody else in the RoboTaxi future. So essentially, my problem right now with the concept of, okay, Tesla's working on a smallish, compact car that's very aerodynamic, very efficient, and that'll be a great template for their RoboTaxi platform, and that's maybe going to require 50 kilowatt hours to go maybe 200 miles on a charge, or maybe a little bit more depending on how efficient they make it, likely lithium iron phosphate and all that. Someone is going to have to make sure that these vehicles are plugged in at every supercharger, and even if you did start mass rollout of the snake chargers that can plug themselves in, the vehicle that can drive around people all day autonomously and not have to stop in charge and, you know, wait for that 50 kilowatt hours to fill up, that's the vehicle that's going to be bringing in more money on a daily basis, which translates to quicker profitability and less turnaround time before you hit the break-even point of the vehicle has made more money than it has cost to build. That's the design that I think is going to make the most amount of sense in the future. It's not going to be about which design is the most universally liked, because these aren't vehicles that are meant to be sold to everyday people. They're not going to have steering wheels. They're not going to have pedals. They're just vehicles that you and maybe a friend get in, and then they drive you to your destination. So because we have data pointing to the idea that the vast majority of vehicles on the road have less than 2 people in them, that's why I think even though the Aptera is a 2-seater, this could still undercut a lot of potential RoboTaxis out there, because it has just such insane efficiency numbers targeting that 100 watt hours per mile. Not to mention, with the solar on the vehicle, there will literally be 40 to 50 miles of range that these Aptera would get for free and not even need to tap into the grid or plug into a supercharger, clogging it up in order to keep driving people around. And if it's in a shady spot, or it needs to drive more than 40 and 50 miles per day, which a RoboTaxi likely would, because it's not going to be sitting in a garage or sitting at a parking lot for extended periods. But because the Apteras are so cheap to build, thanks to their carbon composites, simplicity of parts, and structural battery pack, that's also why I think Aptera as RoboTaxis could actually beat out a lot of other competitors, because they wouldn't necessarily need a DC fast charging station to report back to. You could just have a bunch of Aptera sitting in a parking lot as long as it's sunny, and they're all charging up, and then the ones with a full charge, they go out, drive people around, and then once they get low on battery, they go back to that parking lot, and the new ones that are done charging can go back out and keep driving people around. You could have a completely self-powered RoboTaxi fleet that doesn't need to access the supercharger network and doesn't need a dedicated DC fast charging station covered in solar panels, which is what you would need right now to turn like Model 3-esque vehicles into a RoboTaxi fleet. So the overhead expense and that upfront cost would be a lot higher for a Tesla RoboTaxi fleet that's using a traditional sexy design, compared to these, which in my opinion would require much less upfront investment, and it would cost less to operate them in the long run. And let's say, for the sake of this example, because I love entertaining the idea that I'm wrong, because I am a lot, well, some people essentially like, hey, you know, I need a RoboTaxi to haul around my family members, or sometimes it's more than just 2 people. I need to move 3 or 4 people in the car at a time. Well, here's kind of the nutty part about that. The Aptera is so freaking efficient at 100 watt-hours per mile that you could actually just make 2 Aptera transport 4 people with those 2 vehicles, and you would probably still beat the energy consumption of a RoboTaxi that's like a Model 3 or something. Because on average, at least, today's Model 3s are getting between 220, sometimes 240 watt-hours per mile. That's on the hyper-efficient route, whereas 2 Aptera, for one, that would still equal out to about 200 watt-hours per mile, so less energy than it would take to move 1 Model 3. And not to mention that Model 3 doesn't have solar on it. So the 2 Aptera can be charging themselves thanks to the sunlight. And even if you don't want to go the solar route for the sake of, well, it's a RoboTaxi and we're trying to make it really, really cheap to build, so let's just scrap all the solar on the Aptera, right? Let's just assume it doesn't have any solar cells on it. Well, in that case, it's still going to cost less to charge, even with a DC fast charger, because of how little energy it consumes. So whether you want that energy from the grid or you want it from solar on the vehicle, when you have a huge emphasis on aerodynamics and efficiency like you do on the Aptera, you can essentially undercut everybody else. So I'm not trying to say that Aptera is going to beat out Tesla with RoboTaxis, because obviously Tesla has an insane lead with their full self-driving computer and their neural net training and dojo and everything. But I'm just trying to say that either Tesla cracks the full self-driving code and then they will either probably come to this design on their own fruition, or consider borrowing the design from Aptera or buying out Aptera, because I think as a RoboTaxi, this vehicle platform honestly makes a ton of sense. Or the other alternative is Aptera could buy the licensing to access the full self-driving computer and the hardware 4, hardware 3 cameras, whatever they want to use to put on their own vehicles, because Tesla has mentioned in the past they are open to licensing out the full self-driving software to other companies if they were interested in it. And so far, no other company has been interested in incorporating the Tesla North America charging standard, except for one company, which is Aptera. Aptera is willing to admit that yes, the supercharger network is better. We want to have the North America charging standard because that is the far superior connector. So similarly, right now, Tesla's not letting third parties have access to the full self-driving code or the full self-driving computer. But in the future, if Tesla did open up those doors and said, okay, other companies can have full self-driving if they're willing to pay us a fee, I feel like Aptera would be the first company willing to pay that fee to access full self-driving, because if we're in a RoboTaxi world, this vehicle design is going to outperform really anything else on the market right now. And even with the hypothetical Tesla 3rd generation vehicle platform, which we haven't seen yet, I have a hard time believing how they're going to beat the aerodynamics, the lower weight, or the lower rolling resistance of the Aptera without just directly copying it. I mean, how amazing would that be if when Tesla unveils the next generation vehicle platform, it just looks exactly like an Aptera? That would be kind of hilarious. But because Tesla's probably more focused on moving 5 people at a time, I think that the first RoboTaxi vehicle is likely going to look basically just like a smaller Model Y. And I'm sorry, as practical as that design may be, it might be better suited for the time and age when people used to own their vehicles outright. You know, if you own a car, you put in a car seat in it, or you're moving around equipment in it, that's when having the hatchback and the 5-seater starts to make a lot of sense, because, you know, we don't necessarily always drive with 5 people in the car, but on average, there's less than 2 people on every vehicle on the road. So in the age of not owning a car and just riding in a RoboTaxi because that's much cheaper, yeah, lowest cost per mile, I think that's still going to be the Aptera, because very cheap to build up front thanks to its carbon composites, structural battery pack, and in-hub motors. Way cheaper to drive because of how little energy it consumes, plus you add the solar on top of that. Essentially, that's why I personally think that even in the world of RoboTaxis, which I have a hard time believing, and I still think we're a lot further away from that, or we might not ever really hit it the way we thought. Even if I'm wrong and RoboTaxis are in a not too distant future, this vehicle design is kind of the inevitable outcome of prioritizing the vast majority of trips, trying to get them as cheap as possible. And sure, for the occasional RoboTaxi need where you're moving 4 or 5 people, or maybe you're moving 7 or 9 people, that's when the SUV RoboTaxis will make a bit more sense. That's when having all that extra room and extra storage will start to be a bit more practical. But with the majority of driving being between 30 and 40 miles a day, I could see like an autonomous, self-powered Aptera fleet that mostly charges itself in an empty parking lot and just tries to autonomously park itself nearby where people are known for needing rides a lot of the time. So either Aptera's gonna license the software from Tesla, or Tesla's gonna rip off this design or buy out Aptera long term. Which do you think is more likely, or do you just not have a belief in robotaxis becoming a thing at all? Feel free to let me know what you think is most likely down in the comments below. And thank you to everybody supporting this channel directly. Seriously, helps us out a ton, as does just watching these videos. So thanks again. Have an excellent rest of your day.